The bridge is set to open later this year, but there are still plenty of hurdles to clear before the new span can welcome cross-border traffic.
The busiest commercial crossing in North America. About $400 million of goods crosses the border every day, so it's a lifeline.
It was supposed to be a bridge to the future. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $4.79 billion megaproject linking Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan, was envisioned as more than just steel and asphalt. It was a promise, a bold bet on economic unity between Canada and the United States. This 6-lane, state-of-the-art structure was designed to be the beating heart of cross-border trade, a shining example of cooperation and shared prosperity. But today, as construction nears its final stage, that promise is unraveling. From the beginning, the project carried enormous expectations. Trade between Canada and the US is no small affair. Roughly $760 billion flows between the two nations each year. Nearly a quarter of that crosses through the Windsor-Detroit corridor, making it one of the most economically vital trade crossings in North America. For decades, the Ambassador Bridge, built in 1929 and privately owned, was the only direct link. But with age came problems: congestion, delays, safety concerns, and it became clear that a new, modern route was necessary. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. Canada took the initiative. In a rare and unprecedented move, the Canadian government agreed to finance the entire construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge. The reasoning was simple. Improving trade infrastructure would boost long-term economic output. Experts projected toll revenues could bring in $70 million annually, enough to recover the investment over time. Canadian officials hoped that the move would also solidify the nation's role as a reliable trading partner to the US. It was a smart play on paper. Construction went ahead, with work crews making steady progress. The bridge's structure soon began to dominate the skyline, with its cable-stayed design promising not just efficiency, but elegance. Supporters hailed it as a model for cross-border collaboration. However, as the project neared completion, storm clouds gathered across the border. The Trump administration, citing concerns about trade imbalances and national security, imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian-made automobiles and auto parts. For an industry that thrives on seamless cross-border supply chains, the move was nothing short of catastrophic. The timing couldn't have been worse. The bridge, which was intended to carry the very goods now being taxed into near oblivion, suddenly had no clear purpose. What use is a $4.79 billion bridge if the trade it was built to support begins to dry up? What began as a visionary infrastructure project is now at risk of becoming one of North America's most expensive miscalculations. A bridge that was meant to connect two nations may now stand as a symbol of fractured alliances and missed opportunities. This is the story of how economic retaliation, political manoeuvring, and strategic missteps turned Canada's proudest infrastructure investment into a geopolitical white elephant. To fully grasp the magnitude of what the Gordie Howe International Bridge represented, you must first understand the problem it was built to solve. The Ambassador Bridge, the sole link between Windsor and Detroit for nearly a century, was no longer up to the task. Built in 1929 during the Great Depression, it was privately owned and operated by the Maroun family, a monopoly that had long stirred resentment in both Canada and the US. The Ambassador Bridge handled over $200 billion in trade annually, most of it via trucks transporting everything from car parts to consumer electronics. But the bridge was aging poorly. It suffered from narrow lanes, outdated customs infrastructure, and frequent traffic bottlenecks. Cross-border delays were common, and the lack of redundancy in trade routes meant that any disruption to the bridge had cascading effects on supply chains. For Canada, a solution was clear: build a new, publicly owned crossing that could handle modern trade demands. Thus, the Gordie Howe International Bridge was born. It was ambitious, 1.5 miles long, 6 lanes wide, equipped with high-tech customs facilities and directly connected to major highways on both sides of the border. The goal was to reduce average crossing times by up to 20 minutes, generating an estimated $1.5 billion in economic benefits over 3 decades. But the project wasn't just about efficiency, it was symbolic. Canada and the US had one of the most integrated trading relationships in the world. Their automotive industries, in particular, were inextricably linked. A single vehicle's components might cross the border 6 to 8 times during production. Engines cast in Michigan could be machined in Ontario, assembled in Ohio, and installed in Windsor. The Gordie Howe Bridge was meant to safeguard and strengthen this relationship. Canada offered to fund the entire $4.79 billion cost, a decision aimed at bypassing US political gridlock and fast-tracking construction. The projected toll revenues would eventually offset the cost, but even without a profit, the long-term gains for trade and jobs were expected to be massive. Construction began in earnest, with Canadian officials heralding the project as a new chapter in cross-border collaboration. Towering pylons rose from the banks of the Detroit River. The bridge's design, sleek, modern, and unmistakably bold, was praised by engineers and economists alike. "This bridge will define the next century of Canada-US trade," declared one senior trade official. "It's about reliability, predictability, and mutual prosperity." For a while, it looked like the gamble would pay off. The project remained on schedule, and trade between the two countries continued to grow. But no one accounted for the political volatility brewing in Washington, a force that would soon derail everything. Long before construction began, the Gordie Howe International Bridge faced a formidable opponent, one not from foreign adversaries or economic forces, but from a private billionaire family whose interests were directly threatened by the new development. The Maroon family, owners of the Ambassador Bridge, stood to lose billions. Their grip on the Windsor-Detroit trade corridor was exclusive, profitable, and, up until then, unchallenged. The Ambassador Bridge wasn't just a toll bridge, it was a cash cow. Every truck, every shipment of goods, every car crossing that aging structure paid into the Maroon Empire. And with nearly 25% of US-Canada trade flowing through this corridor, the numbers were staggering. Losing that monopoly to a publicly funded competitor was an existential threat. So the Maroons fought back. They filed lawsuits. They lobbied aggressively in both Michigan and Washington. They funded campaigns and poured money into political donations. Their strategy wasn't to build a better bridge. It was to stop the Gordie Howe project entirely. One of their boldest moves came in 2012 when they financed a Michigan ballot proposal, Proposal 6, that would have required public approval before any new international crossings could be built. The campaign was misleading, framing the Gordie Howe Bridge as an unnecessary government expense. Voters, however, saw through it. The measure was defeated. But the war was far from over. By 2018, the Maroons shifted tactics. They took their case directly to then-President Donald Trump, airing a nationwide TV advertisement urging him to revoke the presidential permit required for construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge. "Dear Mr. President," the ad implored, "cancel the project, save American jobs, protect our economy." Behind the scenes, their lobbying efforts intensified. Reports later revealed repeated meetings with White House officials, where the Maroons proposed building their own twin span instead. They framed the Canadian-led project as a foreign takeover of American infrastructure. Their pitch was nationalistic, and in the political climate of the Trump era, it resonated with some. For a time, their campaign succeeded in sowing delays. US approval processes were slowed, key permits held up, construction timelines were stretched, costs ballooned. Canadian officials expressed frustration, accusing US bureaucracies of stonewalling a vital economic lifeline. The tension strained bilateral relations. Still, Canada remained determined. The bridge was too important to fail. They pressed forward, weathering legal battles and diplomatic hurdles. Eventually, the necessary permits were granted, and construction resumed in full swing. But the battle revealed a sobering truth. The Gordie Howe Bridge, despite its scale and significance, was vulnerable to private interests and political whims. A single billionaire family had managed to delay, disrupt, and nearly derail a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project backed by a sovereign government. In hindsight, the Maroon family's resistance was just the beginning. Because while they couldn't stop the bridge from rising, they had set a dangerous precedent. That economic power and political influence could block progress. And as the world would soon learn, the greatest challenge to the Gordie Howe Bridge wasn't a private family. It was the government of the United States itself. While the Maroons' attempts to stop the Gordie Howe Bridge posed significant roadblocks, they paled in comparison to the thunderstorm that arrived from Washington in 2025. As construction crews neared the final phases, news broke that the Trump administration was preparing to impose sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian-made automobiles and auto parts. For the Gordie Howe Bridge, built to facilitate precisely this type of trade, it was an existential threat. The rationale behind the tariffs was vague but politically potent. The White House cited national security concerns, trade imbalances, and the need to repatriate manufacturing jobs. Critics immediately pushed back, calling the justification flimsy at best and dangerous at worst. Flavio Volpi, president of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, called the tariffs economic destruction disguised as policy, warning of massive layoffs and industrial collapse. And he wasn't wrong. The North American auto industry is a complex, deeply integrated web of suppliers, manufacturers, and assembly plants. A single vehicle's components can cross the US-Canada border 6 to 8 times before final assembly. An engine block might be cast in Michigan, machined in Ontario, fitted in Ohio, and installed in Windsor. The efficiency of this system depends entirely on tariff-free trade. Introducing a 25% cost at every crossing made the system unsustainable overnight. Within weeks of the tariff announcement, the first signs of collapse emerged. Stellantis, a major global automaker with a large assembly plant in Windsor, halted production, citing supply chain disruptions related to the new tariffs. Thousands of Canadian auto workers were sent home. Parts suppliers on both sides of the border froze hiring, delayed orders, and prepared for cuts. It didn't take long for the economic shockwaves to hit the US too. Michigan-based suppliers, many of whom exported key components to Canada, saw their revenue plummet. "We've worked with Canadian partners for decades," one supplier in Detroit told reporters. "This tariff makes that impossible. We're being punished for a system that used to work." At the heart of the storm stood the Gordie Howe Bridge. Once hailed as a game-changer for North American trade, it now looked like a relic of a more cooperative past. Economists began revising toll revenue forecasts downward. The $70 million annual estimate no longer seemed realistic. Some questioned whether the bridge would ever reach full operational capacity. The irony was unmistakable. Canada had invested $4.79 billion in a project to strengthen trade, only for that trade to be strangled by the very partner it was meant to serve. "It's like building a 6-lane highway to a ghost town," said Dr. Emily Carter, a trade economist. "No matter how well designed the bridge is, if the flow of goods stops, it's useless." The political message was just as clear. In Washington, tariffs had become a powerful political tool, one that could be wielded with little warning and massive consequences. For Canada, it was a harsh wake-up call. Economic integration was no longer enough. Even long-standing alliances could be torn apart by a single executive order. As the Gordie Howe Bridge neared completion, the celebratory mood that once surrounded it had vanished. It still stood tall and impressive, but it now cast a long shadow, one filled with doubt, disruption, and disillusionment. The tariffs hit Canada like a hammer blow, but Ottawa did not stay silent. Within days of the Trump administration's announcement, newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney took to the airwaves with a national address. His tone was firm, measured, and resolute. "This one-sided, unfair, and frankly hostile move by the United States is a betrayal of our North American partnership," Carney declared. "We will not be intimidated. We will respond." And respond they did. Canada swiftly imposed retaliatory tariffs on a wide range of US goods, from agricultural exports like soybeans and pork to manufactured items and consumer electronics. The message was clear. If the US wanted to escalate, Canada would meet them on the same ground. The retaliation escalated what had begun as a targeted automotive tariff into a full-blown trade war. Factories on both sides of the border scrambled to adapt. Canadian exporters, many of whom relied heavily on US markets, saw demand crater. US farmers, previously key supporters of the Trump administration, suddenly found themselves boxed out of Canada's $50 billion agricultural import market. The Gordie Howe Bridge, standing silent but complete, became a symbol of the breakdown. It was built with the vision of boosting trade flows, but now its gleaming towers and empty lanes represented a dream delayed, perhaps indefinitely. The economic pain wasn't limited to statistics. In Windsor, thousands of workers faced layoffs or reduced hours. Supply companies laid off staff. Restaurants, stores, and local services, all dependent on the flow of trade, saw business dry up. Across the river in Detroit, the story was eerily similar. Midwest manufacturers, struggling to find alternate markets or suppliers, began to cut costs and slash jobs. The Gordie Howe International Bridge was never just a structure of steel and concrete. It was a vision of partnership, progress, and prosperity between two nations that have long been bound together by history and trade. But in a matter of months, that vision has dimmed. Will cooler heads eventually steer the conversation back toward cooperation? Or will the Gordie Howe Bridge remain an empty, echoing monument to what happens when politics overrides progress? For now, the future remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. Building bridges is easy. Keeping them open, that takes leadership. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between? I'd love to hear it.